Hi, I'm Tom with Mission Media Coach, and we're doing a little session today called The Role of Stories in a Media to Movement, or M2M strategy, or it's not enough just to tell cool stories. And this is coming from me as coming from a content creation background. I'm a filmmaker by vocation, but I also have a marketing background, and so I sort of look at things from two different perspectives. But there is a shift in storytelling, and so this is especially for you if you are a content creator, but also if you are looking for content to use in a media to movement strategy. If you're not a content creator, you just want to use some things, it's going to give us a way of thinking about content related to strategy. Okay, so that's the shift that we need to make as opposed to being just pure one thing or the other, a content creator or a church planter or a disciple maker or something like that. There's this bridge that we can have. And storying as a concept, of course, has become a really big thing in the business world. There's a lot of emphasis on telling stories as opposed to giving facts and figures, right? So story is the important way that we grab a person's heart and engage with them at a deeper level than presenting information to them, for instance. So stories are an important thing. But what I wanted to call this is your story doesn't matter. And so again, this is coming from more the content creator sorts of people's perspective. And I would subtitle it, "And Other Discouraging Lessons from Filmmakers Like Me," or for filmmakers like me, so content creators. And in any over time in ministry or in any other vocational thing that we do, we have to sort of ask ourselves questions. So what am I now? Who am I now? Am I a feature filmmaker, director of photography, these other kinds of roles, for instance, that someone like me has had over a lot of years? I've shifted toward mobile filmmaking and training people how to create content on mobile devices. And so we have to think about, what do we become as technology changes, as opportunities change in the world, because it does change for us. And I want to start off with a cautionary tale. And this relates to a film that I produced. It was called Ya'iwana Nabalewa, The Enemy God. And it was a feature film set in the Amazon. The story that this film told, just briefly, was the true life story of the first Yanomami indigenous person, Yanomami shaman, to give up his spirits to follow Christ, and told his life story. And it was a feature film. It was a big film project. It was well regarded. We won some awards in film festivals, things like that. It was a really big project. But in the end, it was kind of a disappointment to us in terms of the ministry effectiveness, because it ultimately only had very limited distribution. Now, it's a foreign language film. It's a bunch of indigenous people sitting around in loincloths talking in the jungle. But it's a really interesting film, and we felt it was an important story to tell. But in the end, over the course of making that film over about 7 years, it ended up only having very limited distribution. So from a creator's standpoint, it was a little bit of a disappointment. It's still out there. People are still using it. It's being used in some really strategic ways, but not as much as we wanted, as filmmakers. And I would say it's an amazing story, but without a strategy, or without a really solid strategy in the end to make it work. And so here are some things that I think happened with something like that we can apply to many, many pieces of content, or as we're looking for content. We placed a high priority on great quality content. And in those days, pre the really huge boom of social media, when we were starting to make that film, the saying in film work used to be, well, if you make a great film, people will find it, right? Just tell a great story, people will find it. I don't believe that's really true anymore, because there are thousands and tens of thousands and millions of channels where people find and watch content. In the days we started making that film, it was much more limited. Video stores, television, and theaters, basically. There really weren't big streaming services and all those kinds of things. They were starting to ramp up as we were making that film. So we thought, let's make a great film and the audience will find it, which was kind of the old way of thinking. Now you can't do that. And what we did was we placed a high priority on creating something really great, which is important, but we neglected distribution, follow-up, and engagement with our audience. And now Follow-up and engagement with the audience is one of the most important things as part of distribution. You can't just send things out there and assume people will find them somewhere. It just doesn't work that way anymore. So that's something that comes from my own experience. So I would say now, as a storyteller, the story is not the most important thing. Okay? And that's kind of a radical statement to tell as a storyteller. I would say, though, that I want stories that lead to engagement. Okay? Now, again, I really believe there's a place for great art that is not, it just is beauty. God is glorified by beauty. And you can make art of any kind, film, dance, painting, poetry, anything, and we don't care. It can be just glorifying to God because it's beautiful. But in ministry context, like we're talking about, like in a media to movement strategy, church planting, disciple making movements, we do have a purpose in mind for our stories. And if they are just beautiful and no one sees them, well, we have to make that choice. Do we want that to be the case? So in my ministry now, in my ministry world, I want that engagement. So I want to tell a great story, but I also want stories that lead to something, some kind of engagement, some kind of end fruit, right? That's what we're talking about in a ministry sort of a context. So here's one of the ways we think about that. And one of the things that stories are great at is what I call changing imagination. This is a phrase that I learned probably, 10, 15 years ago. Probably Dr. Frank Preston was the first one who used that phrase to talk about this idea of high-level conversion. And the way I think about it is I look at a man like this. This man's a Buddhist monk, and I would say a person like this, a person in any culture who subscribes or is a part of any sort of a cultural worldview, always has boundaries on what is possible for them. If I am Burmese, I'm from Myanmar, to be that is to be Buddhist, right? To be a Turk is to be a Muslim. To be a Yanomami is to be an animist. Now, they may not necessarily spell that out in an academic sort of a way, but it is their worldview, and they cannot imagine anything else. No one like them is anything other than that. There are no Cambodians who are not Buddhist. Of course not. No one knows of that, right? And so this idea of being a follower of Jesus or even labeled a Christian is something that can't be imagined. So part of what we do with our stories, I think the strongest thing a story can do is change the imagination about what is possible for me and what is my true story. Is the story that I have subscribed to, the story that I've been taught all my life, the true story? And you actually have competing stories with competing worldviews. So changing the imagination of a person is one of the most powerful things stories can do. Much better than conveying information about something, right? So there's the shining promise of technology. We have media, we have social media, we have all sorts of different kinds of digital, we have artificial intelligence and virtual reality, all these kinds of things. And so those hold out this sort of shining promise, and it's easy to jump into all those things. And we tend to get to the point where the technology becomes sort of magical to us. And what I want to do is sort of say, okay, the technology has really good, there's aspects of the technology that are positive and have some downsides and all these things. Everything's a mix. What I want to say is, in terms of story with new technologies, I want to say we have the opportunity to do what we call wrapping stories in strategy. Okay, so it's important to tell good stories, but wrapping them into a strategy is how we understand the best way to have them bear the fruit that we want. Okay, so if I want my story to impact people's lives, to touch people's hearts, to be a part of God's movement, I want to wrap my story in a strategy and not keep it as sort of a separate thing, really. So we want a media strategy. Here's a couple ways to think about it. I want a media strategy as I'm developing my story that evaluates audiences for content and questions that are important to them. So what are they thinking about, talking about, wrestling with, questioning, all of those kinds of things in a specific audience. And I want a strategy that's going to be able to engage those people in ways that are distinctive to them. Okay, this is who they are, this is where they are, this is the time that they're doing it, the technologies they use, and this varies from culture to culture, city to city, country to country, all those things globally. It's not always a one-size-fits-all situation, right? We know this. We want to avoid especially as content creators, this idea, if you build it, they will come, or even as media strategy, if we say, we're going to be on Facebook and have a page. Just because you have a page on Facebook does not mean anybody will see it, right? I think we know this now. Just because we make a movie does not mean that it will have an audience. You can even stick it on the internet. Being on the internet does not mean people will find it, right? We know this now. It's too vast a place. So if you build it, they will come is not the attitude we want. We want to create something strategically. So what if we start with, for instance, and imagining a persona. So the word persona, you can find other resources around here that talk about this idea of persona in more detail. But a persona it's more than just, oh, I want to reach a man in Egypt, or I want to reach a woman in Bangladesh, or something like that. It's not just or I want to reach everybody in a country. It is more specific, and it involves who they are sort of generically, gender and age and place like that. But it also includes things like the questions they're asking. What are the things that are on their minds? What are they asking that might open up opportunities for a conversation? We then think about the channels they're using. Okay, are they on social media, or do they listen to shortwave radio? Because they're in a place where the internet hasn't really taken hold and had that much of an impact. We also then ask the question in that channel where they are engaging with our media, how can we engage with them? Can we get comments? Can we do any kind of advertising? Can we bring them into a real conversation? How does it work? Shortwave radio works different than Facebook, right? But all of them could be valid. Then we imagine our stories. So I like to do this in sort of a reverse sort of a way. And here's an example of it. So for instance, this is a project that my team in Madrid was working on a few years ago. And we talked about, okay, men in Spain. Okay, and it's not just men in Spain. We want to create a piece of content that's reaching out to men in Spain, but it's not just everybody, right? Because what do you talk about then? Let's pick a thing that might be on their minds. Men in Spain who are affected by an epidemic of domestic violence. They might be victims of domestic violence when they were younger. They might be perpetrators of domestic violence. They might know that this is a thing in their life that they've got to deal with, but they don't have any answers for that. We know also that they're using Facebook or other kinds of social media all the time. They're on it all the time. Okay, we know also that on that channel, for instance, of Facebook or some other big social media channel, we can post, we can have pages, we can place targeted ads, we can interact with people via comments to actually have a conversation with people around this specific particular topic. Then we ask ourselves, now, what kind of visual story can we create to encourage that sort of conversation? So we don't just create any video, we create a conversation, a story that relates to this topic and this man in these channels. And this is what we created. So that was created by my International Media Ministries team a few years ago. And here's what I just want to reiterate. Here's what we did. We're imagining a kind of an audience, a kind of question they're talking about or thinking about, where we can connect with them, what channels are they using to consume content, how can we engage with them in that particular kind of channel, and what kind of story could we have. Now, I would say if I was running this in a campaign, that version has a specific sort of a question, was violence learned, or those kinds of things. I would ask questions. I would run multiple kinds of things like, have you experienced this yourself, or have you or anyone else experienced this? Do you want to talk to anybody? I would create questions that were in drawing people into conversation. If you've experienced this but have never spoken to anybody about this, would you like to? Come talk with us. So we create places on the web, in social media, private groups, that kind of thing, to talk about these kinds of issues. And so you can use powerful visuals like that with different kinds of questions at the end and try them to engage with people. So it's an example of a story that was created based on these other kinds of things, based on a strategy that could be used. And so as I'm thinking about this, when I'm talking about the strategy, I'm thinking about, okay, here's a story, but the story needs to be targeted, needs to be focused on something to help them change imagination about what could be possible. So am I trapped in this circumstance? Is there a way out? Those are bridges into the gospel, right? And so we wrap these things together, not just as a standalone piece and throw it out there, but we say, how can we also create an engagement system, a follow-up network, a coalition of people who will actually engage with people in social media to help them change the imagination about what's possible for them? That's what I think is the most powerful use of stories. And this honestly is the reverse of how many of us do it. Sometimes we are just the content creators, and we create things and we want to make them available to people and say, oh, here's these stories we came up with, but they may not always connect as well with the field. There may be field people saying, oh, I just need something to post on my Facebook page. What do I do? And we just grab anything, right? What if we did these things as an integrated, wrapping the stories, wrapping the content with the strategy? It would be much more effective for us. Finally, the last thing is that we want to make sure that the story or the content, whatever content it is, serves our ministry goal. That serves the broader ministry mission and vision. So if we want to see the kingdom of God made manifest among this people group in a visible, tangible way, we have ministry goals that lead toward that. We want to make sure that these things are all connecting together. So for instance, we don't just measure how many people follow our page or watch a video on YouTube or anything like that. We don't just measure those little bits of feedback we get. Those are important, but they're not the most important thing. What we want to measure is the bigger goals, the real goals. How many people are engaging with Scripture in groups? Is the Scripture available? Are they engaging with it in groups? How many multiplying disciples do we have? How many multiplying churches do we have, right? So we want to make sure we also don't get caught up in measuring the wrong things and saying, oh, look, lots of people are seeing this video, but we don't see anything happening that's a real goal that we have, our real vision we want to see happening. So we want to keep that in mind. And as we think about this, as I think about the strategy, there's many other videos and resources, here and in other places where we can look at this idea of the strategy for attracting people, engaging with people, connecting them in with groups, forming groups around persons of peace, those sorts of concepts, and then backing up and saying, okay, now what sort of content can feed that? How does that all work together? We don't want to create any of these pieces independently. We want them to all be integrated together. That, we think, and our experience is that bears the most fruit in these ministries. So 2 questions just to leave you with, how well does the content that my ministry creates or uses from somebody else reflect the idea? Begin with an engagement strategy and goal. How do I begin with an engagement strategy and then find content that helps to achieve that? And the second question would be, what might we be able to change in our approach based on this idea? Are there things that your team can brainstorm to say, what if we found content that was more strategically connected with our engagement? Or if you're a content creator, could we create stories by talking with field workers to say, what are the most important things people are talking about? Let's help you create content that helps to feed those things. And I think that's going to be just a much more fruitful way. So let's think about how we can incorporate this idea of wrapping content and strategy for the glory of God and His kingdom. Thanks.